Okay, thank you for the gentle listener letting me know that my mic was on mute. So I was just sitting there talking into a screen like an idiot. But hey, we're here with the Pat Flynn Show, off to a rough and rocky start. But we're going to make up for it because we're going to talk about, do carbs make people fat? And spoiler alert, the answer is no. And we're going to talk about why. There's a lot of confusion about this topic. Nutrition and nutritional science is, of course, a subject of great and fascinating debate. But I think that there are areas where we can really have some really good clarity. And what I want to discuss is an article that recently came out. It's recently published over at Science Mag. I'm sharing it on my screen. We're going to read through this because this, I think, shows really what is wrong with the hypothesis that obesity is caused, if not solely, primarily because of carbohydrate intake. So we're going to look at that. We're going to read a little bit of the article. I think it will be clarifying. I think it will be interesting for you, gentle listeners. Don't worry if you don't see the screen. I will read aloud and I'll make the relevant points known. And let me just say up front, right? Let me make some distinctions up front. We will be arguing that the carbohydrate insulin model is a failure, right? That it does not provide an adequate explanation of obesity. However, that is not to say that low-carb diets aren't or can't be useful. There's a distinction here, and it's an important distinction. We love our distinctions, right? And we can at once say that low-carb diets help a lot of people. They help people to improve their health, improve their body composition, lose weight. We can say that, and that is consistent with the claim that the carbohydrate insulin model is not an adequate explanation of obesity. We can those claims are consistent, and I hope that everybody sees that. So when we talk through this article and we explain why we think that carbs as quote unquote the bad guy or the reason people get fat is wrong, that is not to necessarily say that nobody has any reason never to follow a lower carbohydrate approach, right? Rather, what we will say is that there needs to be certain fundamentals in place for weight loss to happen, one of them being caloric control, and that for some people, a low carbohydrate diet can help them achieve that, and it can actually be very beneficial, even if it isn't necessary. And that while it can be helpful for some people, it's not necessarily going to be the solution for everybody, nor does it have to be, right? So we can take a more nuanced position on this. And I think that should be liberating because it will give people the freedom to explore. We can gain clarity on the fundamentals of nutrition. Okay, like what are the basics? What is true? What does have to be in place if we want to improve our health and body composition and lose weight? And then once we kind of have these boundaries, right? These fundamentals, then there's kind of a lot of room to explore. There's a lot of different options we could take. Maybe we want to play around with intermittent fasting or calorie cycling or carb cycling or just portion control or whatever, right? Or maybe we want to take a high carb approach. We'll see that's a totally viable option as well. So there's a lot of room there that once you have the fundamentals in place, you can of course give considerations to personal preference, what has worked for you in the past, your lifestyle. And I think that's good. Like we want this sort of flexibility when it comes to weight loss because people are different. There's different contingent circumstances they find themselves in. So, if the only tool you have is a hammer and then every problem becomes a nail, but not every problem is a nail, then you're restricted as a coach or a practitioner. We don't want to be artificially restricted. Right? We want to have an adequate toolkit for solving problems. And if we glue ourselves to a sort of way of thinking, a certain hypothesis that isn't true, we're not only probably going to hamper our own progress, but almost certainly we're going to hamper the progress that we try to help other people make as well. So I just want to start off with some of those descriptions. So good to see that the sound is coming through now. Hey, Grant, how are you? Good to have you here. Phil, awesome. If you guys have any questions, just drop them in. We are live streaming right now, and we'll see if we can do some Q&A as we move along or towards the end. Also, I don't know if I forget if my mic was on mute when I first said this, but I'm in Wilmington, North Carolina. We're doing a little vacation for the week. I was left alone in the vacation house. So kind of different lines of providence converge. And as it would happen, the internet down here has been terrible, except for today. For whatever reason, the internet is actually working today, and we seem to be streaming without any major issues. So I've got the house to myself and a working internet. So I thought, well, I better just do a live stream and get caught up on some content. So good to have all of you here. And yeah, let's just dive into it, shall we? So I'm gonna blow up the screen here so you guys can see this article if you're watching. Again, if you're not watching, no issues. I'll talk through the relevant parts. So let's start by just describing what the carbohydrate insulin model of obesity is. This is something that's become very popular lately. There's various authors. I'm not going to mention any names. I don't think that it's entirely relevant at this point. But it's very popular with those who promote a ketogenic diet. Now, again, these criticisms are not to say that there's no value in a ketogenic diet. I'm not going to go that far, but oftentimes people who are promoting a ketogenic diet do so in conjunction with this particular model of obesity. And that's what it is. It's a model. It's something that's meant to try to explain why people get fat. And that's what models do, right? They try to explain data, they try to make predictions, and this is how science works. We sort of go out, we gather data tediously, we reason up to some type of hypothesis, try to construct some type of model. Then we ask, well, what would we expect if this model were true? And then we try to make predictions, and then we see if those predictions are successful. And if they are, it would seem to count in favor of this model. If they aren't, it would seem to count against such a model. So science properly understood is always about, of course, testing hypotheses, the hypothetico-deductive method, and it gives us degrees of confidence. It never gives us, an absolute certitude. We're not engaged in like metaphysical deductive reasoning here. Science is all about giving us degrees of confidence. That's what it is. Now, sometimes we can have extremely high degrees of confidence. There's certain sciences that give us that, right? Certainly physics has various theories in physics we have a very high degree of confidence in because they are so predictively fruitful, so powerful at explaining data, but not all sciences are like that. But here we have a particular model. It's called the carbohydrate insulin model. And let me just read from the article because I think they summarize it very well. And now I am quoting. By the way, this article, again, was recently published in Science Mag, so I will link it in the show notes for those of you who want to read the whole thing. We're not going to go through the whole thing, but I encourage you to do so because I think it is a very well-written article. So let me quote it now. Here's the first paragraph. It says, the primary cause of common human obesity remains uncertain. There are several plausible explanations, including the popular carbohydrate insulin model, which suggests that body fat gain results from consumption of carbohydrates that stimulate postprandial insulin, which promotes energy storage and further intake in a vicious cycle. The theoretical basis of the carbohydrate insulin model has been refuted by several recent experiments. We suggest that although insulin plays an important role in body fat regulation, the carbohydrate insulin model fails because it focuses on the direct action of insulin on adipose tissue after the consumption of a meal containing carbohydrates. Rather, we propose that the role of insulin in obesity may be better understood by considering its pleiotropic action on multiple organs that is driven by factors mostly independent of carbohydrate intake. Reconsidering the role of insulin may improve our understanding of the causes of obesity and its treatment. So let's just summarize a couple points here. So far, first off, they're admitting, hey, we don't actually know the primary cause of human obesity, right? We got some indicators, we got some clues, but we can't really boil it down to one primary thing. However, it's important to understand that when it comes to science, we can often gain degrees of confidence of what is not the case, even if we aren't entirely sure of what is the case. And that's still useful, right? Like eliminating options is still a very useful thing. Like it helps narrow our hunt. So just because we aren't always ready to give an absolute positive answer and say, like, here's a definite solution, it's good to know what isn't. It's good to eliminate options and say, okay, this seems wrong. This seems like it should be taken off the table of options here, or at least it should be given a lower credence level. So then they talk about what the carbohydrate insulin model is, and it's saying that it's a model which says the primary cause of obesity or fat gain comes from the consumption of carbohydrates because of the effects of insulin, the direct effects of insulin. You have a meal containing carbohydrates, and then you get caught in this vicious circle because insulin promotes energy storage and it increases your appetite. And so it's kind of driving energy storage and fat gain, and it makes you hungrier. And then you just get caught in this vicious cycle, right? So it's insulin and carbohydrates. These are the culprits, right? This is what the model's saying. Now, the article says, and I think this is right, that this is a plausible explanation, right? And in terms of scientific models and explanations, there's something elegant about this. It's a simple explanation. It seems like it's got a degree of plausibility here. It's not completely crazy, right? You don't have to be a lunatic to think that this could possibly be true or could possibly provide an explanatory story here. And they admit as such. It seems like a plausible explanation. However, scientists cannot forget to be empiricists, right? So just because we have something that is a plausible explanation doesn't mean that it is the actual explanation. And scientists must see whether their model can adequately account for the data that we have, and whether the model makes successful predictions. And as they summarize, the carbohydrate insulin model does not. It fails in its predictions, and what we see in various experiments is not what we would expect if the carbohydrate insulin model were true. And oftentimes it's the opposite of what we would expect. So if a hypothesis predicts X, and we see X, that's good news for the hypothesis, right? This is basic scientific reasoning. However, if the hypothesis predicts X and we see not X, that's not great news for the hypothesis. It doesn't mean that it's completely falsified or failed, but it definitely counts against the hypothesis to some degree. And that's what we're going to find out here as we go through the article. So hopefully that's some sort of initial stage setting. Let me read the next paragraph, quoting again. The carbohydrate insulin model puts the adipocyte, which those are fat cells, at center stage by highlighting the role of insulin in promoting fat storage and inhibiting its release. So what we're saying there is insulin promotes fat storage and it sort of blocks it from being released, right? And this is what the carbohydrate model is proposing. This is why insulin's the culprit right here. It just drives fat storage and kind of locks it in there. Continuing on, carbohydrate consumption stimulates insulin secretion, which partitions circulating fuels such as triglycerides toward storage in adipose tissue. This is postulated to reduce the energy available for metabolically active tissues such as skeletal muscle. Deprived of fuel, these non-adipose tissues experience a state of cellular, quote, internal starvation that motivates the individual to respond as they would to actual starvation by seeking and consuming more food and reducing metabolic rate to conserve energy. Therefore, according to the carbohydrate insulin model, excess energy consumption is the result of adipose tissue fat storage due to carbohydrate-driven postprandial insulin. The corresponding obesity solution then is to replace carbs with dietary fat, which does not stimulate postprandial insulin secretion, the so-called low-carb, high-fat, or ketogenic diet. Excuse me for 1 second. There we go. Sorry. Had to clear the airways. Okay, so very clear, I think, summary there of exactly what the model is proposing to explain obesity, and then what the solution is, right? Hey, carbs, insulin are the bad guy, especially after we eat carbohydrate-heavy meals. This is driving fat storage, and it's making us to consume more. It's making us hungry. It's sort of promoting a sort of a pseudo starvation, right? This cellular internal starvation. So this is what the problem is, and then here's what the solution. Well, the solution is just to go low carb, high fat, right? Now, this is what the article says next. Conceptually, testing the carbohydrate insulin model should be simple. Randomize people to consume different diets varying wildly in carbohydrates and fat, and then measure obesity prevalence in each diet group. But such an experiment, if prolonged, raises ethical concerns due to potential harm, and if short, raises concerns about whether the absence of effects was due to the short duration. Moreover, ensuring adherence to the assigned diets is not currently possible in people living outside of a laboratory setting. A good but imperfect solution would be to run the studies on experimental animals, with the caveat that improved control there comes at the expense of failing to completely capture the complexity of situation in humans. Okay, so what does that paragraph say? It's saying this. It says, hey, here's actually a benefit of the carbohydrate insulin model. This is something that's cool about it, and this is something we like about different models and hypotheses. Is that it conceptually this should be an easy test, right? Like the model's clear about what we should expect if it's true. So it shouldn't be that hard to really test this model, which is a good thing, right? Like it gives us a sort of clear criteria here, right? Put people into different groups, vary their carbohydrate diets wildly, try and control for other factors. And then, one group super low carb, ketogenic, another group, put the carbs way up. And then what we should expect if this model is true is that the low carb group should fare much better. It should be right. They should lose the weight. They should experience the favorable outcomes while the high carb group does not. Right. So if the carbohydrate insulin model were true, then we would expect that the lower carb group would do better, would have better results. The lower carb group would have better results than the higher carb group. So we like that, right? We like that this provides a clear model that would be conceptually easy to test, but then it recognizes stuff that we've always known in nutritional science, that hey, this is kind of hard to do with humans. There's various ethical concerns. We can't, it's kind of hard just to like lock people in a box and control every aspect of their life, at least in the long term, right? So there's always going to be criticisms that come up that, in certain experiments, hey, we didn't give it enough time, or if you use animals instead of humans, that, hey, rightfully so, humans aren't rats, right? So if we see something in rats, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to hold true for humans. Now, these are important considerations, but they, of course, are not absolute defeaters. And the paper is going to go on to explain why. So let me just, we're going to read about 3 or 4 more paragraphs here. So bear with me, and then we'll dive into the larger discussion. We'll take some questions. So in this context, and I'm quoting again, a large dietary manipulation study exposed mice to 29 different diets to address the impact of diet composition on body fatness. In 16 of these diets, the macronutrient manipulation allowed a direct test of the predictions of the carbohydrate insulin model because protein was held constant while fat and carbohydrate intake varied reciprocally between 10 and 80%. The carbohydrates were a mix of cornstarch, maltodextrin, and sucrose, typically regarded as refined high glycemic index carbs that induce high blood glucose and insulin response. Right, so we're really going to get the insulin response here. The mice were exposed to the diets for 12 weeks, which is about equivalent to 9 years in humans. And of course, the carbohydrate insulin model prediction is that the dietary carb increased with the postprandial insulin would result in obesity with the mice, right? That the mice would develop obesity and eat more calories if the carbohydrate insulin model were true for the increased carb group, right? However, the opposite happened, right? So it failed in its prediction. Mice feeding on diets with a high proportion of carbohydrates actually ate fewer calories and gained both less body weight and body fat despite higher postprandial insulin. Now, this would appear to refute the carbohydrate insulin model. Although this appears to refute that the model, uncritical extrapolation from mice to humans is problematic. So this is a data point, right? It's not an absolute refutation because we are of course acknowledging that rats aren't humans, right? We're different. So we can't just say that because this is the case with the rats, it's absolutely going to be the case with humans. However, it is a test, and it is a test that so far does not lean favorably for the carbohydrate insulin model. Now, let's continue because we have more than just rat studies on this. So the article continues now, and I'm quoting once again that although controlled feeding studies lasting multiple years in humans are not feasible, the carbohydrate insulin model can be tested by examining its predictions using shorter-term experiments. For example, if individuals are exposed to diets with very different proportions of fat and carbohydrates, the CIM predicts that a high-carb diet will result in greater postprandial blood insulin concentrations that drive fat accumulation in adipose tissue, thereby increasing hunger and energy intake compared to a lower-carb diet. This prediction was tested in a month-long inpatient metabolic ward study where 20 adults were randomized to receive a diet composed of around 10% carbs, around 75% fat, or a diet with around 10% fat and around 75% carbs, and instructed to eat as much or as little as they wanted. After 2 weeks, participants switched to the alternate diet. In accordance with the CIM predictions, the high carbohydrate diet resulted in much higher concentrations of circulating postprandial insulin and therefore should have partitioned more energy to body fat storage, thereby increasing hunger and energy intake compared to the low carbohydrate diet. However, around 700 calories a day less food was consumed on the high carb diet, and participants reported both diets to be equally satisfying and pleasant with no differences in hunger or fullness. Furthermore, despite substantially higher daily insulin secretion, only the high carbohydrate diet resulted in significant body fat loss. So this is a severe strike against the carbohydrate insulin model because it made one successful prediction, right, as the article acknowledges, that it did result in higher concentrations of circulating postprandial insulin. However, it failed in its other, we would argue, more important predictions, right? That people would eat more because of this and gain weight. And we found that neither of those happened, right? In fact, the opposite. It not only failed in its prediction of seeing X, but we saw the opposite of its prediction, that the higher carbohydrate diet resulted in people eating less, and only the higher carbohydrate diet resulted in significant body fat loss. So that's significant, friends. That's a significant data point. Does it absolutely disprove it? No, of course not. But what we talked about, science is about gaining degrees of confidence, right? Testing models, seeing which models best explain the data and make the most accurate predictions. So that can't just be dismissed, right? Now, maybe somebody wants to dive into the details of that study and quibble with that, and that's fine and are welcome to do so. But right now, it's a data point that is significantly against the carbohydrate insulin hypothesis. Continuing to quote the article now. Although this was a relatively short-term experiment, another study found significantly increased satiety after 10 to 15 weeks of consuming a high carbohydrate diet compared with a low carb diet. Furthermore, a 1-year study in freely living individuals randomized to consume low carb versus high carb diets found no sustained differences in objective measures of energy intake. As a result, long-term average weight loss was almost identical, and individual differences in postprandial insulin secretion did not predict who lost most weight on each diet. Therefore, the energy intake predictions of the carbohydrate model failed to materialize in both short and long-term studies. Okay, very important. I'll read one more paragraph. The carbohydrate insulin model also predicts that decreased insulin secretion during a low-carb diet should increase body fat loss by mobilizing fat trapped in adipose tissue, thereby restoring the fuel supply to metabolically active tissues compared with an isocaloric diet with higher carbs. Alleviation of cellular, quote, internal starvation in these tissues should therefore increase energy expenditure. 2 studies admitted participants with overweight or obesity to metabolic wards with strict control over food intake for 1 to 2 months and showed that although carbohydrate restriction led to substantial decreases in daily postprandial insulin secretion, both studies found less body fat with carbohydrate restriction compared with isocaloric high carbohydrate diets. That is another significant strike against the CIM. In the other study, a low carbohydrate ketogenic diet led to I skipped the sentence here. In one study, the reduced carbohydrate diet led to significant decrease in energy expenditure. In the other study, a low carbohydrate diet led to a small transient increase in energy expenditure that dissipated within a few weeks. So what's the key points here, friends? The key points is that what we would expect if this model were true, right, is not what we actually find when we run the experiments and we look out to see if the model can accommodate and explain the actual data. And if we're trying to be objective in assessing different hypotheses of why do people get fat, this one does not seem to work. It doesn't seem to make sense of the data. It doesn't seem to make accurate predictions. And so it's failing. It's a failing hypothesis. Does that mean that it should never be investigated again? Does that mean it's completely off the table? Does that mean that it's logically disproven? No, but I would argue right now it is in not good shape. It's in not good shape. So what we should be doing is what this article does is trying to find a different explanatory story. And I'll let you guys all read the article yourself. I'll link it in the show notes here real quick. I'll put it in the podcast show notes over at Chronicles of Strength as well, because they talk about what they actually think, what role insulin may play in the obesity question. And it's a little bit more complicated. And that's important, right? Because when it comes to forming a scientific hypothesis, we do like simplicity, right? And we have to give the carbohydrate insulin model credit, right? It's a simple hypothesis, right? It's very easy to understand conceptually. Okay, insulin, boom. We don't have a whole lot of explanatory entities here. The problem, however, is that simplicity cannot be the only scientific consideration. Yes, we have Occam's razor, and people often misunderstand Occam's razor. Occam's razor says we shouldn't multiply explanatory entities beyond what is needed to provide an actual sufficient or adequate explanation. However, do we actually get a sufficient or adequate explanation? Because if our hypothesis is really simple, but it doesn't actually do the explanatory work that we need, then it's not really a simple hypothesis. It's a simplistic hypothesis, and it's inadequate. And sometimes things are just more complicated than we would like them to be. So, we want our hypothesis to be as simple as it needs to be, but no simpler than that it actually starts to fail in terms of explanatory power and explanatory scope or making accurate predictions. And that seems to be the case with the carbohydrate insulin model of obesity. So let me reiterate, does that mean that low carbohydrate diets are inherently bad for you, or that they don't work or anything like that? No, I'm not saying that at all. I know many people, I've worked with many people who thrive, who do really well with low carbohydrate approaches. Dr. Jim eats generally quite low carb. He looks and feels great on it, and that's awesome. Myself personally, I like a cyclical approach. I like to kind of cycle my carbs. That works well for me. I'm lower carb some days, higher carb other days. I know and have worked with many people that thrive on a higher carb approach as well. So again, it's perfectly consistent to say that the carbohydrate insulin model is an inadequate model. It doesn't do the explanatory work that it needs to do. But that doesn't mean that there's no value in low carb diets at all, or that there's no value in specific applications of a ketogenic diet at all. That's going too far. That's claiming more than what we're actually discussing about here. And it's important to understand that we don't actually have to be able to provide a full solution to the obesity problem to know what isn't a good solution, right? So sometimes a lot of the scientific process just it's a process of weeding options, right? Of narrowing the hunt by saying, okay, this isn't right, this isn't right, this isn't right. We kind of eventually narrow in, and hopefully we gain conceptual clarity of what the solution might actually be. So, okay, that's about all I wanted to say on my end. But if you guys have some questions or comments, let's hear it. Let me turn over to the chat box now. Brendan says, hold on, guys. Sorry, I have this weird allergy thing. I don't think I'm actually sick, but I find myself coughing a lot. Something in the air here down in North Carolina. Weird state, very different than Wisconsin. I saw a lizard the other day. Still trying to process that. Don't see lizards very often where I live. Brendan says, how do I get to drink beer and eat ice cream constantly and not turn into a fat man? LOL, just kidding, kind of. Well, I'm not a big drinker. I probably have like a few beers a month, if that. But I do love ice cream. And in fact, ice cream, there's certain combinations of words that Pat Flynn is highly susceptible to. These combinations of words would be things like cheesy and poof, or bread and pudding, right? You see where I'm going with this? And these are things that I certainly indulge in from time to time. And as long as you have the foundations and the basics in place, right? So one thing we know that is important for body composition and weight loss is caloric control, right? When we look at people who have success with various different diets, certain things stand out, right? We might not be able to say this is the primary cause of obesity, but we do know things that are generally effective for helping with weight loss. One is some form of caloric control. Another big thing is protein, getting adequate protein. When you get protein up, good things tend to happen. And one of the reasons that people have success on various diets is because they help them to achieve caloric control. So this is why people, do and have success on a wide variety of diets, whether it's ketogenic, whether it's high carb, whether it's vegetarian, whether it's paleo, whether it's fasting. The thing that's in common here is they help them to restrict calories, to get their calories down. And there's certainly no reason why, within the framework of what actually works for a healthy body composition and just a healthy lifestyle in general, that you can't enjoy, the occasional indulgence. Now, the thing with like ice cream and bread pudding and cheesy poofs is they tend to be hyper palatable foods. And this is something we know is contributive to obesity, is just the increase and consumption of hyper palatable foods. Hyper palatable foods are anything that answers to the description of not being able to eat just one, right? They really trigger the reward centers in the brain. They're not very satiating. They're very easy to consume, to overconsume. They pack a lot of calories, generally not a whole lot of nutrition. So it's really easy to kind of blow your caloric budget with these types of foods, which is why you generally don't want them to be a kind of like regular feature of your diet, right? But just because something isn't a regular feature of your diet doesn't mean that it can't be, something that you indulge occasionally. I think that's perfectly reasonable. So I don't think that you can do it constantly and not turn into a fat man realistically for most people. I mean, yes, somebody could do like a 30-day experiment. I'm sure somebody's done it where they just eat ice cream for 30 days and lose weight. And that kind of proves a certain point. But I don't think realistically, practically, psychologically, that's like a smart or wise thing to do, right? Could somebody do it? Probably they already have. Is that the best approach to take? Probably not. So it's a good question, even though it was somewhat sarcastic. Tim says, after having read the title, I have learned all I need to know. If you need me, I'll be eating donuts. Yeah, so I know Tim's being sarcastic here, but certainly, carbs are not, it doesn't seem that carbs are the primary culprit for obesity. However, that's not to say that you can't get fat from eating too many carbs, right? You definitely can, right? Like, you can overconsume. And you might be overconsuming carbohydrates just as you could overconsume on other dietary approaches. So like we said, a lot of the hyper palatable foods, they tend to be not just high carb, but high carb, high fat as well. I think like potato chips and pizzas and stuff like that, right? So even though we can't say that carbs are the reason that people get fat, we can say carbs are sometimes a reason, or sometimes maybe even often a reason people get fat, but it's in a different way than this model proposes. So the takeaway from this is absolutely not that people should just go start eating a standard American diet, a junk food diet of pizza and beer and donuts, because we do know, as I said previously, that one of the reasons people get fat that we can be confident about is, again, the consumption and the availability of hyper palatable foods. Donuts would certainly fall into the category of a hyper palatable food. I don't know, you like, I love donuts, right? Who doesn't? If you're being honest, who doesn't love a donut? I don't trust a man who says he doesn't love a donut. So yeah, don't do that. Don't just go eating donuts. Frank's got a question. He says, I'm asking just so it's here. I was thinking about burpees. They worked for getting me shredded last summer. Why does the burpee have so many critics? Like, on what grounds do fitness people have to doubt the effectiveness of the burpee? Is it like, man, burpees win me, they are therefore ineffective and you should never do them? Okay, so kind of a side topic, but we can talk about burpees if you want. Yeah, let's talk about burpees. Why are people critical of burpees? First off, I've got no like a priori reason to like hate on burpees. I think they're fine exercise. There's level changes, good mobility. You get some upper body stuff, you get some core stuff, you get some lower body stuff, you get the heart rate up. I've got nothing against burpees. I think where people get a lot of kind of pinky raising fitness professionals, you know who I'm talking about, the reason they don't like burpees is just because like they're so overprescribed and almost abused by like the super gung-ho, this is my first 2 weeks being a personal trainer type of person that just like ravages grandma with burpees in a fitness class in like a wildly inappropriate way. I think that's why burpees often get criticized. it's not the burpee itself. It's the context which the burpee often finds itself situated in, which again is just what I described. It doesn't often seem to be programmed necessarily intelligently. It just seems to be this kind of default, let me just put you in a certain degree of discomfort or pain just because that's what I feel like personal trainers should do. And so they're kind of used as a crutch for, I think, sometimes naive or inexperienced trainers or coaches in lieu of more intelligent programming. And I think some of those criticisms are merited, certainly. So I think that's why it gets hated on. But if you are thinking about how to intelligently program and you kind of got the basics down, I think the burpee's great, man. I'm totally down with burpees. I think that they are a good full body exercise. I like the 2-pump burpee myself. I like getting down, doing 2 pumps of the push-up, 2 pumps, hop back up. You can do lunge variations. You can do squat variations. So you get a lot of mobility. You get level changes in the burpee, which Dan, John, and I have talked about. And that has a very useful conditioning effect, just also real life benefits. You get muscle endurance. You get some strength work. You can get some explosive work. So I think I've got nothing but favorable things to say about the burpee in general, and given a greater kind of more intelligent programming context. So that's the fairest answer I can give to you, my good friend Frank. And I hope that you find it somewhat satisfying. But don't feel like you have to give up the burpee. I don't think you do. In fact, I might do some burpees after this. I have a 28 kilogram with me. That's what I brought to North Carolina. I've been sharing some of my workouts through email, and we've been having fun with that. And a burpee sounds like it could be a nice compliment. Okay, let's take some more questions. Mikey says, I just finished slow carb. I lost weight but looked worse and had low energy. Intermittent fasting and feeding 8 hours with carbs makes me feel the best and look the best. Hey, cheers. So the slow carb diet, if I remember rightly, was first promoted by, I think it was by Tim Ferriss, right? Correct me if I'm wrong here, Mikey. Is that the one you're talking about in his book? Which one was that? That was the 4-hour body, right? And that's where you just eat a certain type of carbs, like you eat the beans, for example. It's a lot of beans, a little bean heavy. And you're saying you lost weight, but you didn't look great, and your energy wasn't fantastic, and that you feel and look better when you combine I can't talk today, guys. This is climate change is messing with my brain. When you combine intermittent fasting and feeding 8 hours with carbs, to that, I say cheers, my friend. That's awesome, because it sounds like you've got basics down, right? So you have intermittent fasting, which is a good way to just control calories, right? That's what fasting. So the interesting thing about fasting, there was an article in Cell Metabolism not long ago that shows that fasting actually has benefits, physiological benefits, irrespective of weight loss. So fasting might be something you want to do even if you don't necessarily want to lose weight. But obviously, one of the reasons fasting helps people lose weight is because it helps to achieve one of the basics, which is caloric control, caloric restriction. If you just fast for 8 hours a day and you kind of hold everything else equal, you're taking big chunks of calories out of your diet, right? And then you can have, you can resume your eating. You can have an eating window. Maybe it's 4 hours, maybe it's 8 hours, maybe it's somewhere in between. And then you have your protein, you have your carbs, you feel good, you look great. And you say, this works for me, this works for my lifestyle. I would say, dude, that's awesome. And I support you 100%, because this is kind of what I'm talking about, right? It's good to see what the outlines are, what the basics, what the boundaries are, where it's like, okay, as long as you have these basics in place, you're probably going to do well. But then there's a lot of room. The way I think about it is kind of like a fence to a playground, right? Like if you stay within this fence, you can have a lot of fun and a lot of success. If you go beyond the fence, then you possibly risk not doing something very effective, maybe even something harmful. So it's good to have those boundaries, but there's a lot of room to play within those boundaries. Maybe you experiment with intermittent fasting and carb cycling or strategic meal replacements, stuff like that, right? So this is why I think it is important, because people vary. People have preferences. People respond differently to different protocols. Like I said, I know people who really thrive on long fasts. I know people who don't. I know people who really thrive with carb manipulation techniques. I know people who don't. I know people who really thrive with higher carb. I know people who don't. But it's about getting the basics and the fundamentals down. So yeah, good. I mean, it seems like you've tested it and you found, okay, this approach works better for me. The basics are in place. You're feeling good. You're looking great. So I would just keep on with what you're doing. Grant says, I'm currently doing a keto diet and intermittent fasting and have never felt better loads of energy. Yeah, like I said, there's nothing that I've said here, even though I've criticized this model, that should disparage anybody from just writing off a low carb approach or saying that people don't have success with it. They obviously do, as you, Grant, are reporting. Uh, Great friend of mine. He's a regular host on this podcast, Dr. Jim. He follows a very low carb approach. He feels awesome on it, and it's worked awesome for him. So cheers to you. And once again, want to reiterate that distinction I made at the beginning, that just because I think that this model is inadequate does not mean that there's no value in a low carb approach, or that people can't or won't benefit from it. I think it's fair in the realm of play, right? On the playground. It's like, if something that you think will work well for your lifestyle, if you know you feel good on it, then go for it, right? Go for it. And I think there's, possibly some interesting specific applications that the keto diet can resolve. In fact, traditionally, the keto diet was used as a way of treating epilepsy. It still is. Now, that isn't going to be the case for most everyday people, but there are specific applications that the keto diet seems to really help people with. So Grant says he's doing 1 meal a day with the occasional 24-hour fast. Hey, man, that's awesome. And he says sugar is extremely addictive for me. So that's good. That's important. It's good to know where you're at. And certainly working with so many people for so many years, people are just so different, man. Like some people, excuse me, 1 second. Trying to mute the microphone before I start hacking. Some people do really well with just your very basic moderation. Like they can moderate things really well. Other people, they need to take more of a hard line and abstain, because they know even just letting in a little bit tends to cause them to go kind of off the rail. So they do much better with a much more rigid, strict, call it hardline approach. And that's fine. That's person dependent. That's person by person. If you know that that's what works for you, you feel good on that, you're happy with that, power to you. Other people, they can be more flexible. They can moderate. So, everything in moderation, including moderation, right? Like moderation works good for some people. It definitely isn't the thing that works well for other people. I think for a lot of people, a hardline sort of cold turkey approach is the way to go. It's not certainly the best option for everybody, but for some people, I think it is. So thanks for sharing that, Grant. That's helpful. Mikey says, would it be safe to say low carb is good for the sedentary and that low fat is good for the athlete? If I'm going limited calories, I think it makes sense to choose glycogen over fat for energy. I think I don't think that is completely unwise to say. I think people who are more sedentary, certainly in my realm of experience, the more sedentary a person is, the more amenable a low carb approach tends to take. However, I know people who are very active, very competitive, even including Jim, who's low carb, and man, he's lifting hard, he's rolling hard. So I'm not going to rule out that even the more active, non-sedentary person could do well on a low carb diet. But yeah, certainly I think having the carbs for your athletes a lot of times makes sense as well. So again, there's room for experimentation there, and I hope it's something that continues to get studied. In fact, I think that's an area where we would benefit from more research on that. Mikey says, okay, it was Tim Ferriss. Cool. Yeah, I don't keep up with Tim was. By the way, Tim was on this podcast when the 4-Hour Chef came out. It was before we even called the podcast the Pat Flynn Show. So if anybody wants to see me interview Tim Ferriss, just Google Pat Flynn, Tim Ferriss. You can check out an old interview I did with Tim. I haven't kept up with a lot of his work since, so I can't really comment on the sort of stuff he's doing now. Frank says, probably bad to ingest soybean canola oil involved in the standard American diet. Yeah, no, I think that there are just some foods, right, that it's probably best to limit or avoid, right? I remember in high school, I was really getting interested in nutrition science. In my AP public speaking class, I did this whole presentation on trans fats, and yeah, no, I agree with you, Frank. I think that there's some foods. The problem, however, is when certain things get wrapped up with other things that they don't need to be wrapped up with. So you'll sometimes read a lot of these kind of books that promote a low carb diet or a ketogenic diet or whatever. It's not just restricted to that. That will say a lot of true things, but they'll wrap it up in something that itself isn't true or is at least dubious. And I think this is one of those. Like there's certain foods that I think like at the very least they're just not really doing anything beneficial for you. And there seems to be good evidence that they could be harmful in terms of inflammatory responses and stuff like this. However, that doesn't mean that the carbohydrate insulin model is true, right? And a lot of times, so the thing is, like, people make in nutritional science, they make a lot of claims, and a lot of these claims are often independent. So people can be right on some things, and they can be wrong on other things, and often that's the case, right? So, what you have to do is you have to be patient. You have to just kind of parse things independently. You don't want to throw babies out with bathwater, type of thing. So yeah, I don't have a disagreement with that. I myself tend to avoid soybean oil and canola oil. In fact, when I start to have funky oils, my joints hurt. They hurt bad. So I think there's something definitely there. Again, something I hope is further researched of the various potential harmful effects that certain foods, especially these sort of more highly processed seed oils and stuff like that, might have. And that's fine. That's worth looking into. But that's a sort of separate thing from the model that we've been evaluating here. Good stuff. Grant says, I have plenty of energy to work out and do kettlebells 5 to 6 days a week and still do a physical job, all low carb. So yeah, that's not completely unheard of. That's why I didn't want to say earlier that low carb could not accommodate a more active and intense lifestyle, because I know for a lot of people, it certainly does. Frank says, I've definitely taken the Flynn approach to cyclical keto. It's awesome. He's paleo most of the time, but I have to confess, 75 days of keto did physique wonders. Look, I'm just going to keep emphasizing this so people don't misunderstand what I'm saying, because this is always the issue, right? When you do talks on nutrition, people often respond to things that they want to hear rather than things that somebody actually said. I am not saying, nor have I ever said, that the ketogenic diet or low carb diets do not work or cannot work. People have had great success on these things. My focus of this conversation is not against that. It's against a particular model meant to explain obesity that I think we have very strong evidence against. And it once again is entirely consistent to say that this model is false, or at least very probably false, and that people can and do still have success following lower carb and ketogenic diets. So, Frank, as you know, certainly, I do like cyclical diets. I like calorie cycling. I like carb cycling. I like fasting cycling diets. I think cyclical approaches to dieting make a lot of sense for a lot of reasons. And yeah, good stuff. So again, not discouraging people from investigating or trying any of these things. It's just do it from the right perspective. That's all I'm trying to share. I'm just trying to get clarity on that. Phil says, thanks for the clarity on this article. The carb insulin model hypothesis makes a specific claim on the mechanisms of carbs with obesity, and just because that claim doesn't seem to hold doesn't mean we need to wholesale change our dietary approach to carbs. Yeah, thank you. You totally get exactly what I have said. It's all about making distinctions, friends, distinctions that make a difference, and understanding what is being criticized and what isn't. And you guys are smart. My audience is smart, but I'm sure once this video lives on YouTube long enough, there'll be some people who come in and start throwing an absolute fit and temper tantrum, thinking that I've said that low carb diets don't work or could never work. That's never what I said. I never said such a thing. Nor would I say such a thing, because it's false. Right. Let's just do a little bit more here. Pedro says, not having highly palatable foods at home makes a huge difference in achieving a caloric deficit for people that are not good with moderation, in my opinion. It's difficult to overeat on apples, but not ice cream. You're right, so Pedro. Environment matters. The circumstances you find yourself in matter. Barriers to entry are important. Easy temptations. Humans are complex, right? So one of the things I always tell people is, like, whatever dietary approach you take, whatever fitness approach you take, make your environment as conducive to success as possible. Don't put roadblocks up if they don't need to be there, right? So clean out your cupboards. Like get the crap out of your house that you know is going to be an issue when you're hungry, because you will be hungry, right? If you change your dietary protocol and you start restricting calories, you will get hungry, right? This is just one of those things that we're going to have to deal with. So what are going to be your strategies when you get hungry, right? How are you going to deal with that? Well, here's one thing is just don't have stuff around that's going to become increasingly tempting when that hunger sets in. So just changing and altering and tweaking and manipulating your environment ahead of time to set yourself up for success later on, this sort of cognitive offloading, is a very simple but very often overlooked part of the success puzzle when it comes to weight loss. Make your environment as conducive as possible for success. And part of that is just don't have the crap in your house that you know is going to give you a hard time. Yeah. And Phil agrees. He says, I agree with Leo and love the apples comparison. Imagine how many apples a person can eat in one setting versus how many donuts. It's not hard to imagine the caloric difference. Yeah, and this is what we were saying before about the hypocaloric issue with foods. They're very easy to overconsume. You usually can't just eat just one, but an apple, it's coming with a lot of fiber. Like, who gets fat off of eating apples? I don't know. Maybe somebody does, but it's pretty uncommon. So yeah, have that stuff around, right? And get the stuff out that is going to be problematic for obvious reasons. Last question, and we're going to wrap this one up. Grant says, do you think no matter what diet you're on, it always comes down to calories in versus calories out when it comes to weight loss and weight gain? Okay, so this is something that is often presented in a very unhelpful way, right? So we know that thermodynamics is at play, right? Nobody's denying that. However, there's a lot that goes into what there's a lot that goes into the question of energy balance, right? And equilibrium and input versus output. So in one sense, it's like, yes, thermodynamics. We're not denying that. However, there's psychological factors, there's hormonal factors, there's metabolic factors that will determine or influence how much you take in versus how much you put out, right? And this is where it becomes much more nuanced and complicated, that just sort of Twitter or Instagram posts that just say it's just calories in, calories out are really unhelpful, because it refuses to acknowledge the complex dynamics that are involved in being a human being. So, I mean, we already talked about like the hyper palatable foods. It's like, yeah, like somebody could, as I'm sure they already have, lose weight eating just McDonald's. Like, I know there's like documentaries on that, right? Or ice cream. However, most people aren't like putting themselves out on YouTube to prove a point like that. So most people who frequent a McDonald's are going to struggle with keeping their calories in check, because the foods are so easy to overeat, because they're so hyper palatable, because they cause you to crave more and want more, and they have implications for triggering the reward centers in your brain, and their low satiety index, and all these other things, right? So this is kind of a both and. Is the reason that I almost never say it's just calories in, calories out, is not because like I think that thermodynamics doesn't have something to say here. Obviously, I do. I think that the conversation is just so much more complicated than that when it comes to the real everyday life, the real everyday physiological and psychological factors of what it means to be a human, and the relationships that we have with food and people around us and the environment that we find ourselves in. That it is something of a pet peeve of mine when these various fitness gurus just get on Twitter and they say they have these slogans and these cliches. It's just like, it's just calories in, calories out. So to me, it's either it's kind of it's true, but the sense that it's true, it's almost trivial, or it's unhelpful. Like, we need to say more, and we should be saying more, because people have been saying it's calories in, calories out for a very long time, and it doesn't seem to have solved the problem. Like people aren't dumb, right? Like, and most people know generally, if you sat most people down and you said, I'm going to electrocute you if you don't tell me what a healthy diet is. Like, most people could give you the sketches of a healthy diet, right? They could. The problem is people struggle to implement, right? They struggle to get it done. That's where, like, most people understand. Like, they get that a diet, the standard American diet, is problematic, and most people understand it's problematic because it has them consuming too many calories. So it's not like some huge piece of revelation for most people to understand that calories matter. Like most people, they kind of get that, right? The problem is, how do we help them? How do we move past these simplistic slogans and start offering more nuanced and helpful conversations? And that's what I'm trying to do here. I don't whether I've succeeded is for you guys to judge. So I'll leave it at that. I hope that you found this conversation useful to some extent. I hope that it was clarifying. I hope that the distinctions were clear, what we were saying, what we were not. So do me a favor. If you like it, or give the heart if you're on Facebook. Share, subscribe, ring the little bell on YouTube. If you're on iTunes, please rank the show. Really helps. And I appreciate the awesome comments and suggestions. And we will catch you on the next episode of The Pat Flynn Show. Cheers, my friend. We're going to close with some sweet music. Goodbye.